recording. Okay, so today is the beginning of the art history part of the course. Up till now, we've been talking about sort of artist shop talk, you could say, like how the sort of thinking that goes into making art and choosing a medium and how artists sort of work in their studios. But from now on, it's going to be like an art history course. And as such, it's going to be sort of a review of world history. So if you have had a world history course, then this will be a review of that for you. If you haven't, it'll be an introduction to world history, kind of like. Okay, so first, I think it's important to, when we're talking about the history of art, we're talking about the earliest human uh, endeavors, really, going back to the beginning, very beginning of human history in prehistory, before anything was written down. And to understand that, you kind of have to understand what are humans, which may not be something you've thought about before. And the thinking about what a human is has evolved over the last even 10 years. So humans used to be considered like their own family of hominids. But now biologists consider the family of hominids to include 4 genuses, or genera is the correct way to say it. So these are our closest relatives in the hominid family, and that would be the orangutan family. There's 4 species of orangutans. They're the pongos. The pongos. I sort of wish I was a pongo. I like that name better. Then there's 2 species of gorillas. And then there's 2 species of chimpanzees, the famous bonobos and the regular chimpanzees, the kind of mean chimpanzees. But there's only 1 genus and species of humans. But the thing is, there used to be a lot more. And that's what we're going to talk about first. Okay, so we're the hominins. We're not the pongos, gorillas, or pans. We're the hominins. And there used to be a lot more hominins over history, like from the beginning of the hominid family. Okay, so, but they're all extinct except for us. So Homo erectus used to be a hominin that was widespread in Asia and Africa and Europe, but they evolved into Homo neanderthalis and Homo denisova. And we're not related to these 2 guys really, except through Homo erectus. This is our genus and species, Homo sapiens. So these are like our cousins, and they don't exist anymore. We kind of wiped them out, but not before interbreeding with them. Now that's confusing, because you might be thinking, okay, well, how can people of this genus interbreed with people of this genus? Because the definition of a genus is that they don't interbreed. Well, if you've ever had a mule, you know that they do. Okay, horses and donkeys are different species, but they do interbreed. It just so happens that the mule is sterile, right? He can't make a baby mule on his own. So, but these families are close enough related that some Neanderthal genes do survive in modern humans, especially if you're a European. So if you have European ancestry, it's likely that you have some Neanderthal genes. The Denisovans possibly contributed some of their genes to Tibetans, that is, people from northern Asia. And that may be why the Tibetans can survive on the Tibetan plateau, where normal Homo sapiens people can't. They can reproduce on the Tibetan plateau, but the Han Chinese can't for some reason, probably because of the Denisovan genes. Okay, so how did we hominins where did we come from? Okay, so hominins, Homo sapiens, evolved in Africa, probably in East Africa, and then around 200,000 years ago, and then migrated to the rest of the world. Um, and that was a tricky business because a couple of times the number of Homo sapiens in the world almost got wiped out, mostly by a volcano. But okay, so about 100,000 years ago, some Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, that is, people exactly like us genetically, left Africa and went into the Middle East and got as far as India, but then something really, really bad happened while they were in India. Not all of them. I mean, there were still obviously humans that didn't immigrate from Africa, but a huge volcano erupted in this area here and buried India, or maybe it was right here, and buried India in about 5 feet of volcanic ash and caused a sort of nuclear winter all over the planet that lasted about 5 years. And it's thought that the number of humans on the entire planet was reduced to like 10,000 people, which is, I mean, that's a tiny amount. That's like the number of people that live in Salina or something. And so all of those people, or maybe Salina's a little smaller. Let's say Clay County, I think has about 10,000 people. So the entire human population in the world dropped to about 10,000 people, and all except maybe in Africa. So they think maybe it didn't affect people in Africa, but a lot of humans were wiped out, and so it's kind of amazing that humans survived at all and came to dominate the entire planet eventually. Okay, so around 40,000 years ago, some humans immigrated out of Africa into Europe. And when they got to Europe, they encountered first they encountered this sort of, it was during the ice ages. So they encountered a landscape in Europe that's completely different from the way Europe looks now, because there were sheets of ice that had covered most of northern Europe, but below the sheets of ice, south of the sheets of ice, there was a sort of tundra environment that was just covered with game. Some of the game or fauna of the ice age was completely different from animals that live in Europe or North America now. For example, these woolly mammoths. Let's see, somebody needs to mute their audio. Ashlyn or Hunter. Hunter, could you mute your audio? Because there's a little bit of, yeah, thanks. Okay, so yeah, somebody else needs to mute also. Just make sure you're muted, Hunter. Oh, I can mute you. Okay, I'm muted. All right. So there were weird animals in Europe 40,000 years ago, but they were delicious. So the people that immigrated into Africa hunted these giant woolly mammoths and other types of game that proliferated on the tundra of the Ice Age Europe. And, there was weird stuff like woolly rhino and so on. But we'll see some more pictures of these animals in a minute. Okay, so the Paleolithic era in Europe is the Old Stone Age. So paleo literally means old, lithic means stone, and these people did not eat corn and wheat and soybeans ever. There were none. Okay, they were hunter-gatherers. That is, they didn't have a garden or a farm. They just or domesticated animals, except late in the Paleolithic, dogs started hanging out with people. But before that, there were no domesticated animals, no cattle, no chickens. I mean, they were, but they were wild. Okay, so people got food by hunting and gathering plants and things. So there weren't very many humans. So when humans, Homo sapiens, let's say, went to Europe 40,000 years ago, they encountered other humans that were already there, and that was the Neanderthals. So the Neanderthals had been in Europe for a long time. They were used to ice age conditions. They were very cold hardy people. They were much bigger than Homo sapiens, us. They had bigger brains, and in some ways they were better suited to life in Europe than we were. But they went extinct about 15,000 years ago, and nobody really knows why Neanderthals went extinct. Apparently, they coexisted with Homo sapiens for several tens of thousands, from 40,000 years ago till about 15,000 years ago, but then they disappeared. So we don't really know why that happened, whether Homo sapiens people, committed a genocide maybe against the Neanderthals, or something else eliminated them. But some of their genes survive in people of European descent, like 4% of our genes. Okay, so now we're going to start talking about art finally. Okay, so this is some of the earliest art ever. As you can see, it's a representation of a human woman, but minus a head. So these are small. They're carved from mammoth tusk. Let's just review what a mammoth is. Okay, that's a mammoth. And their tusks and bones were used to make all kinds of tools, and it was easy to carve. Okay, so this is made out of mammoth tusk, which you could say is a type of ivory, really. And there's only one of these. This picture just shows it from two points of view. Okay, so you see her from the side, and then you see her sort of from the front. And you can see that it's not a very realistic woman, besides the fact that her head is missing, and instead there's like a little pendant place where you could put a little hole that you could put a string through, so you could wear it around your neck like a charm, a magic charm maybe. So the Hohlfeld's figure has these very exaggerated breasts and stripes across her abdomen, and a kind of exaggerated vulva and exaggerated hips. So what could this be about? I mean, most women don't actually look like this. I mean, it certainly is hard to make your boobs stick right out like that, unless you're wearing a push-up bra, and she's not wearing a bra. So this is not representational. It's a bit abstract, right? And so something to think about that we could talk about on Friday in the discussion, or you could write a discussion question about, is why did early humans make these representations of women that were so exaggerated? So we'll look at another one. Okay, this one has slightly more realistic boobs. Anyway, she's now called the Woman of Willendorf. So Willendorf, like Hohlfels, is just a place in Europe, in Germany. Hohlfels may be in Austria. Anyway, Willendorf is a place in Germany, I think. So it was a place where early Ice Age humans lived. And this is made out of limestone, and it's slightly bigger, maybe about this big. So again, she has these enormous breasts, tiny little arms, no feet, and no face, really. And something wrapped around her head that could be like a braid wrapped around her head, or some kind of hat, netted hat or something. So she's not meant to stand up. Like, she can't stand up like on a shelf. Anthropologists and art historians think that somebody carried her around in their pocket as a kind of charm or good luck against woolly rhinos, maybe. Some people think that these are kind of goddess figures, maybe. Some people think that they might be self-portraits made by women. My theory is that people made them as kind of like um, lucky representations of your mother or your grandmother that you could carry with you in kind of dangerous circumstances, like when hunting woolly rhinos or mammoths or whatever. If something bad happens, you reach in your pocket and you go, "Mama, help!" Okay, so that's what I think it is. A lot of people also think it has something to do with fertility, which is pretty likely because if you think about what if you, I don't know if you've ever tried to go on like a keto diet or a protein only diet, low carb diet, say, I mean, you're going to lose weight. If you only ate mammoth for a long time and you couldn't find any raspberries or roots, edible roots, you would have hardly any carbohydrates in your diet. And it would be very, very hard to get this corpulent. So it's likely that very few women in the Paleolithic era actually were obese like this figure. But if you were, it might enhance your fertility in case of famine while you're gestating. So if you got pregnant in, I don't know, October 35,000 years ago, and your hunting group didn't find any mammoths for a long time, you might miscarry, the baby might not be born healthy. But if you were carrying 50 pounds of adipose tissue, it might help. And maybe that's what it was about. Surviving famine and being uh, fertile, I don't know. But one thing I forgot to talk about when I was talking about the Stone Age, the early Stone Age, was what does it mean that we were in the Stone Age? So here's an example of a stone tool that I found not too far from my house. It's a stone arrowhead, obviously, that's been flaked. It's flint that a Native American person um, made for hunting. So this is a stone tool. And our ancestors in the Ice Age only hunted with stone tools. Here's a slightly bigger, more elaborate one. Um, if you've ever hunted with a bow, you know it's a pretty chancy way to get a deer. But imagine if your heads were not steel but stone. So that's what our ancestors in Europe and in Africa were hunting with. So here's another example of one of these female figures that could be for signify fertility or good luck or something. Now we're going to get into cave paintings in a minute, but there's also representations of women in big women in caves. So this is from a cave in France called the La Selle Cave, and it's kind of like a carved into the wall of the cave, and and again, it looks kind of similar. There are no feet, just these little legs that sort of come to a point. It's, she's got big hips, big breasts, big belly. Um, she's got her hand right over her ovaries, sort of, or her uterus. And people think that these swellings here may refer to the ovaries, actually, that create eggs that go to your uterus, when you're ovulating. So evidently, early humans had some idea of how reproduction worked and how the internal organs of women looked. And then she's holding a horn. I've got a horn too, but maybe I should go get it. Hang on. I'm just going to do this same pose. This is my horn. I use it to make biodynamic preparations for my garden. In fact, I'm going to do that in a few days. I'm going to stuff it with manure and bury it and then dig it up next spring and spray my garden with the contents. There's some left over. It's kind of dried out stuff. I think we can assume that this woman was not making biodynamic preparations because she was not a farmer. She was a hunter-gatherer. So why would she be holding this horn in her hand like that? And I think the reason is, well, we don't obviously can't know because these people didn't leave any written records of why they did anything. But there are 13 little stripes or marks on this horn. You could say that the horn looks a little bit like a quarter moon, like when the moon's new or old in the last few days before it wanes, or the first few days after the new moon. So why would there be 13 stripes on this horn? And why is she covered in this red ochre paint, some of which is worn off, but there's some red clay kind of rubbed onto her body? So one theory is that there are 13 lunations in the year. So a lunation just means a new moon. And those were the original months. There were originally 13 months, not 12. The Christians or Romans changed it to 12. I'm not sure who did that. But there were originally 13 months of 28 days each. Now, if you're female, you know that a normal menstrual cycle is about 28 days. It can be shorter or longer. But normally it's about 28 days. Amazingly, that's exactly the number of days between the full moon and the next full moon. So early humans noticed that and were like, oh my God, human females and the moon are in cahoots somehow. We don't know exactly how, but this could not be a coincidence. So female human fertility and the moon were deeply connected in the minds of early humans. So this horn kind of represents a moon and 13 lunations. That is 13 chances to get pregnant, y'all. 13 ovulations. So what about the ochre? The ochre is thought to be a representation of menstrual blood. So without that blood, none of us would be here, right? That's what the lining of the uterus gets blood in it in case there's a fertilized egg that lands in the uterus. And if it does, you don't get your period, right? And the fertilized egg is kept alive by menstrual blood until it becomes a baby and is born. So menstrual blood is a key part of human fertility. And early humans knew all that. Okay, so early humans were not only obsessed with female fertility, but also with food. Food and sex, the two most important things for human survival. And their food was meat, mainly. I mean, they dug up roots and things, and they found berries and things. And later, we started growing corn and beans and things like that. But in the Paleolithic era, it was pretty much meat for breakfast, meat for lunch, and meat for supper. So what were these animals that Paleolithic people were hunting? Well, there was a huge variety. And the way we know that is partly from the fossil record, but also from these paintings on the walls of caves, which is called parietal art. So parietal art is simpler way to say it is cave art. And these are really, really, really old. So 30,000 years old at the cave in France called Chauvet. Now there were petroglyphs in the Americas and in Africa, and there's early art like this all over the world, but the cave paintings in Europe are kind of special and unique because they're paintings, not pecked away like a sort of drawing with a chisel, but they're actually painted with charcoal and ochre and various earth pigments mixed probably with animal fat or something like that. So what are these animals? Let's just check out the animals here. Okay, so these are aurochs, early type of cattle that's ancestor of modern cattle. You can see there's a kind of horse here with a slightly bristly mane, more like a zebra or a donkey than a horse with a modern horse. And then there's a rhino here, and there's this adorable little hippo standing on his hind legs. Now, it's and a turtle, which is pretty unusual. It's not, and bison seemingly fighting each other. It's not, this is not meant to be a representational scene of this is what I saw one day in France. These drawings were superimposed on each other. That is, somebody would make a drawing here, and then 1,000 years later, somebody would come along and make another drawing here. So over time, these drawings were sort of layered on top of each other, you could say. And there's no real background. They're also always in profile. That is, you see the animal from the side. You don't ever see them from the front, weirdly. So there were certain conventions of visual art even then, and it was to draw an animal in profile. These are more of those horses. So people didn't ride these horses. They weren't domesticated. None of these animals were domesticated. They were all wild animals that people hunted with spears, basically, or ran them into traps. That was the other way they caught them. Okay, so we were not the only predators on the plains of Europe at this time. There were other, probably more effective predators. In other words, there were lions in Europe at that time, really huge ones called cave lions that were a lot bigger than modern lions. So, but they hunted the same way that modern lions do. Lions apparently hunt mainly in packs of female lions. And so here we have a bunch of, a pride, I guess you call them, of female lions hunting. Now, I read a book one time about cave art written by a man who had spent a lot of time in Africa watching modern lions hunt. And he said that the lions he observed hunting in Africa had this exact expression on their face, this kind of evil eye, you could say, that, or predatory look that they train on their prey to kind of frighten the prey and make them freeze. And I've seen border collies do this exact thing. It's called the border collie eye, and it's very intimidating to ruminants, whether they're modern sheep or aurochs. So I think the point is that the naturalism of these drawings is real. That is, human artists of the Paleolithic period observed animals very closely and could draw them in a pretty accurate and representational way. There were certain rules, like only drawing them from the side, but basically they're a kind of representation or naturalism, which I think is amazing. Most of them are just outlines, like the ones we've been looking at. In other words, they're drawings. But this is more like a painting where the shape of the bison here has been colored in. So, of course, there were millions of American bison in North America when Europeans first arrived and then proceeded to almost hunt them to extinction. But there were also bison in Europe. And I think there's a few surviving European bison in Poland or something. But there were a lot of them in this Ice Age Europe, and they were a main source of food for our European ancestors. So this is European bison in a cave in Spain. So there are some in the Altamira cave is in northern Spain. Okay, so the Lascaux cave is one of the the drawings in the Lascaux cave are slightly less old than the Chauvet drawings. They're from only 17,000 years ago. And there's some really interesting drawings in the Lascaux cave, including this drawing of a prehistoric elk. So prehistoric elk were much bigger than modern elk. I mean, modern elk are big. They're a lot bigger than white-tailed deer. So I don't know, you may know somebody who got an elk license, for example, and went up to the land between the lakes and got an elk. Well, one elk is going to really fill up your entire freezer. That's all you need, really. Whereas a white-tailed deer might weigh, 100 pounds. The modern elk weigh a lot more than that. And prehistoric elk were taller than humans. I mean, their withers, this part right here, was taller than a human, so taller than 6 feet. So very intimidating animals with huge racks. Okay, now this is we're back in the Lascaux cave now, which is, okay, we're in the Lascaux cave. So there's a famous part of the Lascaux cave called the Hall of the Bulls. And this has many representations of these prehistoric cattle called aurochs. So let's just look at how Paleolithic artists represented a bull. So it's clear that that's what it is, right? It's naturalistic enough and representational enough that you can tell it's a bull. But it's important to the artist to show you that the bull has 4 legs and 2 horns, and these horn drawings are sometimes called twisted perspective, because the theory is that the horns look almost as if the head of the bull has turned slightly towards you. I mean, maybe next time you see a horned cow or bull, look at it and see if you think this is twisted perspective. I mean, to me, it doesn't look that twisted, but maybe so. Okay, so humans are almost never represented in the cave paintings. There are very few representations of humans. There are handprints of humans, and some small ones signifying that children and women were in the caves. So we don't know who painted these painted. It wasn't necessarily adult men. The hand paintings are sometimes just handprints, but people also put their hand on the cave wall and went and blew pigment around the outside of their fingers and then removed their hand so there would be like a negative space where their hand was. So there are different ways of leaving your handprint in the cave. But besides those handprints and the relief carving of a woman that we talked about a few minutes ago, there are very few representations of people or men, even though, and this is one of the very few, the shaft scene of Lascaux, which is pretty famous. And it's in a shaft, like there's a drop off inside the cave, and in there is this this painting or drawing. So it's pretty clear that you have an enraged bison here. His tail is up. He's charging, and his back hairs are up, and he's got his head down, and he's charging at this unfortunate man. And his entrails are hanging out. No wonder he's mad. So this looks like a broken addle or spear, a kind of spear chucker thing that gave a little more power to your spear, which was a tool that prehistoric people used. The hunter here also has an erection, which you have to kind of wonder about. Like, you wouldn't think that would happen when you were being gored by a bison. But so, and in addition to that, this unfortunate man has the head of a bird. Now, you probably noticed that the animals are drawn in a very naturalistic and representational way, but the human is just this sort of goofy stick figure that isn't really drawn with any care at all. It's just kind of an abstraction that represents man. It's not really a naturalistic representation of a human. It also has this bird head, and then there's kind of like a staff over here with a bird's body on it. So what could this be about? So obviously we don't know, but I'm going to tell you some of the theories. Okay, so one theory is that this is not a literal representation of um, something that actually happened, but a kind of shamanic trance thing, where this guy is a shaman of sorts or a magic man, and he's in a trance state in a sort of different world between the worlds, you could say. And that's what his bird head signifies. That is, as a shaman, he can fly from the surface of the earth up to the heavens. And water birds were particularly shamanic symbols because they could not only go up, but they could go dive down, like a loon or a duck. And maybe that's what this is, some kind of duck. Um, I read a long, elaborate theory about this spear and the way that it seems to enter the anus of the bison and exit at its penis, and that has some sort of meaning, deep meaning that's universal and present in drawings in Africa, rock drawings in Africa, and so on. I don't know whether to credit that, but it's interesting. So all of this is just speculation. We don't know that maybe this really did happen. Although why would they put a bird head? Maybe the bird head just signifies, okay, he died, he went to the afterlife in the sky or whatever. Maybe. Who knows? Okay, so it's interesting to think about and talk about and research. Okay, so where was all this going on? All these cave paintings. This is a map of France and Spain. So the Pyrenees Mountains are sort of the border between France and Spain. And the ice came down to north, slightly north of this map. But below the ice, and there were Neanderthals still living down here in Spain at that time. But here, Homo sapiens, that is uh, ancient Europeans, were living in these caves overlooking river valleys here, which apparently were just teeming with migrating game. So they could be in their cave up on a sort of cliff, and they could look down on this incredible valley of grass and water, perfect for ruminants, and the reindeer herds and the mammoth herds and the bison herds would come through here, and they could be up in their cave and look down and say, hey, here they come, and I'll run down there and get them. So that's one theory about why there's all these cave paintings in this area, is that it was just a perfect place. It was sort of like a tree stand in a way, the ultimate tree stand. I mean, it would take longer to get down, right? And you couldn't shoot from the cave and expect to hit anything. But I think, I'm not sure when archery was invented, but I think these people are hunting mainly with spears. So they had to come down out of their tree stand and hunt the game down here, which they sometimes did by driving them over cliffs with fire or using tar pits or various kinds of traps. It wasn't just about stabbing animals with stone spears. Okay, so again, we don't really know who made these paintings. There are footprints and handprints of very small people deep in the caves. So it's possible that children went back there and held these little lanterns for artists who were using their hands and other tools to make these paintings. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of theories about what the paintings were for or what they were about. Some people say that they were a kind of hunting magic. That is, they were a way to envision a successful hunt. Some people say that they were part of a kind of shamanic religion that involved going into a trance and being in the cave with these, people didn't live where the paintings are. People lived in the mouth of the cave, in the daylight, sort of. And the entrance to the cave would just be a kind of dry area that was a little warmer where they could build a kind of teepee and live. But the cave paintings are deep in the interior of the cave that was really dark. So people only went back in there for ritual reasons, is that theory. So it was some sort of ritual having to do with magic or shamanism. My personal theory is that it was a way to ensure that game would continue to be plentiful. That is, if you made the drawings on the interior of the cave wall, which was almost like a uterus, it was like implanting an embryo there that would later be born into the world, and you could hunt it, and there would always be plenty of food. Because sometimes Paleolithic hunting was a little bit wasteful. They would drive animals over a cliff, and sometimes there'd be more than they could butcher and dry, make pemmican out of. So there must have been some worry that maybe they were over hunting, and I think this might have been a kind of magic to prevent the game from disappearing, but that's just my theory. Okay, so some anthropologists have sort of speculated about what Paleolithic Europeans, that is Ice Age Europeans, looked like. And this is a kind of a model or a representation based on the fragments of bone and so forth that have been found that suggest what early Europeans might have looked like. Okay, so now we're going to the Neolithic period. So that means the new Stone Age. Now, people are still using stone tools like this for hunting. And, hunting has not gone away in the Americas or anywhere else. People are still hunting with stone arrows, but they're also gardening with stone tools. That is, you can make a hoe. You tie one of these, a bigger version of this, to a stick, and you've got a pretty good digging tool. So people were making stone tools for gardening and living in settlements. That is, instead of following game and moving around all the time, people started settling down into villages, building permanent dwellings, and making gardens. So that's the beginning of farming, and that's called the Neolithic age, and that changed everything. So, including art. So, besides the cave drawings, most art that from the Paleolithic period is small portable sculpture or something like that. But beginning in the Neolithic period, when people stayed in the same spot for generations, much larger, ambitious projects began to occur, such as Stonehenge, which was built over a period of 1,500 years. And it's still there. It's kind of a ruin, but we're going to look at some pictures of what it once looked like. Okay, so this is a model of what Stonehenge, a recreation, digital recreation of what Stonehenge looked like when it was completed. So it was done in stages. It was initially this circle of stones, and there's many stone circles in Europe. People all over Europe, these pre-Christian people, who were we don't really know what their religion was, but it wasn't Christianity. They built these stone circles all over Europe, but Stonehenge is the most elaborate and the best well-known. And then later, they added this ring of stones with these uprights and horizontal elements. So post and lintel architecture, this being the post and this being the lintels. And these trilithons that are even larger stones that were erected sometime later. Okay, so what was this about? Well, again, the builders of Stonehenge didn't leave any written record of what they meant for it to be, but there's some clues. Okay, so one big clue is that when you're standing in the middle of the horseshoe on the morning of the summer solstice, that is the longest day of the year in summer, which is around June 20th, the sun, you will see this, and you're standing here, you will see the sun rise right here between these two stones. And then at the opposite solstice, the winter solstice, you'll see this, if you look this way, you'll see the sun set over here. So some historians think that this was a kind of giant calendar, or a sort of farmer's almanac, you could say. That if you were there, you could tell when you were approaching the longest day of the year. That is, the sun would be rising further and further, well, always in the east, but further to the northeast. And then one day it would start going the other way. So you can observe this yourself if you are observant. You can see that, you know, like at my house in the summer, the sun comes up sort of over there. Right now it's coming up due east because this is the equinox, right? So it's coming up in the window that faces the east, but in the height of summer, it's sort of to the northeast, and then it sets sort of to the northwest. So the sun doesn't come up in the same place every day. It depends on what time of year it is. So ancient people were aware of this, and this could be a sort of clock or calendar that indicated to them when they needed to have all their planting done. Like even now around here, if certain crops are not planted by June 20th, you might as well just not plant them, because they're not going to have time to do anything before frost and before the light starts to get less every day. So June 20th is kind of a deadline for field corn, for sweet potatoes, for butternut squash, things that take 100 or 120 days to mature. If you don't plant them by then, it's too late. So it could be that that's the case for that's what this is for. But it was also about burial. It was also a burial site. So important people, and maybe even not so important people, were buried in funeral barrows around the area of Stonehenge. So it was a sacred area to the people that lived in southern England. This is where it was. This is a great garden spot, like maybe the best garden spot in the entire world. Because the Gulf Stream comes right up here. It never gets very cold here in the south of England. It's wonderful soil. It's perfectly flat. So there was a thriving Neolithic civilization here with presumably a lot of people. And they were so successful as farmers that they could afford to waste calories, you know, making something like this, which required a lot of manpower and probably oxen power too, to get these stones from 100 kilometers away, which is where they came from, and erect them using these logs and earthen ramps. I mean, it's a big job, and why would you do it if you didn't have some time to kill, you know, and plenty of barley and peas to live on? So that's my theory anyway. Okay, so the Stonehenge was built before the pyramids in Egypt. That's how old they are, and how old the civilization is that created them. But this civilization didn't have writing and didn't leave any written records. The Egyptians, in another part of the world, North Africa to be specific, did have writing. And so around the same time that people in England were building Stonehenge, there was not only, there was a society in Egypt that was like a nation, really, like a state, with a king or a pharaoh, and dynasties and writing. And so we know a lot about Egypt because of that, because they had a type of writing that we've learned to read. And now we know who this guy was: King Menkaure, a pharaoh, and Queen Khmeremneptah, maybe. Or it might be the goddess Hathor, but there's different theories about this. Okay, so this is an amazingly naturalistic representation of idealized naturalism, let's say, of a pharaoh in his prime. And it's not the only representation of King Munkari. There's lots of them, but this is a particularly beautiful one that was discovered in the 19th century by some archaeologists who were digging in a part of um, around the pyramid area and found it. So the thing that I find so remarkable about this is that it's naturalistic and individualized, really. I mean, the pharaoh here is not just some random guy. It's an individual. Now this is a slightly different one, maybe. There's several of these, but he looks like a an individual person. In other words, the sculptor tried to make him look like a person, not just a generalized pharaoh. Although there are things about him that mark him as a pharaoh, and one of them is this kilt that the pharaohs wore, this false beard, which they tied on with a string, which seems really uncomfortable. And then this headdress that the pharaohs wore, um, which usually had a cobra coming out of a sort of cobra crown, and they think that that was once there, but it's missing. That is, it was made out of real gold. And then there's this beautiful sculpture of a queen or a goddess wearing a very thin linen dress. And she also has a sort of either probably wearing a wig. Um, and she's almost nude, really. These are not her panties, by the way. That's her pubic triangle, which was a kind of symbol of fertility. It wasn't embarrassing to have it show. It was good, which may be a little weird for us, but anyway. So, and they both have their left foot forward, which is a kind of convention of Egyptian sculpture. All Egyptian sculpture of pharaohs is pretty much like this. The pharaoh and maybe a queen are attached to a background or a plinth of some sort. The pharaoh has his left foot forward and his right hands, both of his hands right down by his side, holding these scrolls. And she's presenting him to the people of Egypt, basically, and saying, "This is your pharaoh. If she's the goddess Hathor, she's like anointing him as the pharaoh and giving him legitimacy by her presence, sort of presenting him." Okay. All right. So the Egyptians also left a lot of drawings on walls, like the Paleolithic cave paintings, but these were frescoes on plaster. So we talked about fresco in the chapter about painting. And this is from a tomb of a person who was not a pharaoh, but a sort of employee of the pharaoh, like an overseer. So the pharaohs of Egypt basically owned Egypt. Everything that was in Egypt, all the crops, all the animals, and really all the people belonged to the pharaoh, but the pharaoh had underlings who were sort of like managers that managed the irrigation systems and counted the cattle and made sure it was all there and taxed people and all of that. So Nabaman was one of those people. He was an important person. And so when he died, there was this elaborate tomb built for Nabaman that shows him in the afterlife. So Nabaman in the ideal afterlife for Egyptians was a duck hunt. So kind of like this is Nabaman, Duck Dynasty Nabaman. Okay, how did Egyptians hunt ducks though? Not in a blind with a shotgun, on a boat with a kind of stick, maybe like a boomerang. And you can see that Nabaman has caught one. So a lot of Egypt is a delta, like the Mississippi Delta, and so there's a lot of water birds, a lot of wetlands, And here he is, and so a lot of water birds. And so here he is hunting birds, and there's many species of birds depicted here. His wife has actually come with him, and his daughter. But this painting uses what's called hieratic scale. That is, Nabaman is the man here. And this is patriarchy in Egypt. So the woman and the child are much smaller. Obviously, she was not a person that came up to his armpit. She was probably bigger than that. But because she wasn't as important, she's depicted smaller. Also, there was this convention of drawing in Egypt where you drew the top portion of the body frontally. That is, you see his chest, but his head is turned like this, and the lower part of his body is seen in profile. And that's a very uncomfortable way to stand. If you try it, you can't stand that way very long. But that's just how Egyptians drew. It was just a rule, and they drew that way for thousands of years. Egypt was not an innovative society. It was a pretty conservative society, and they basically did drawings and sculptures the same way for thousands and thousands of years, as long as their dynasties lasted. And the reason we know a lot about Egypt is because they developed this type of writing called hieroglyphs, a kind of picture writing. And at some point in the 18th or 19th century, somebody learned to read it using the Rosetta Stone, I think, because the Rosetta Stone had ancient Greek on it and hieroglyphs. So they were able to match them up, and that's a whole story that I don't really know the whole story, but it's interesting that there was this kind of writing and that eventually we learned to read it. Okay, so here's another a painting from Nabaman's tomb where we see Nabaman basically at work, counting the pharaoh's cattle. And here's another guy who's like a drover, taking care of the cattle. This is a drawing that's in two registers. There's this register here and this register here. So two different levels, two different things going on. It's interesting to me how similar the drawing of the domestic cattle are to the drawings of the prehistoric cattle on the caves in Europe. Now, there's no way that the Europeans' cave drawings could have been known to the Egyptians, because those caves were abandoned 15,000 years ago, and no one in Europe even knew that they existed, and certainly nobody in Egypt. They were rediscovered later in the 19th and 20th century, the Lascaux caves and Altamira and Chauvet. So no one had gone in those caves for 15,000 years, and then they were discovered. So the Egyptians didn't know about them. Even French people didn't know they were there. So why is it that that Egyptians represented cattle in almost the exact same way in profile and sort of with the horns and twisted perspective? The only reason I can think of is that this is how humans evaluate cattle. So even if you look through a brochure at the co-op about a cattle auction, they're not going to show them frontally. They're going to show them from the side. The handler is going to be holding his prize bull so that you can see the bull from the side. And I think that's just how we evaluate the quality of a cow, whether you're going to buy it to breed or you're going to kill it with a spear. It's basically meat, right? Unless it's a dairy cow. But still, you want to evaluate the conformation of the animal that way. And so I think there's some sort of universal human desire to see cattle in profile. And even ducks, maybe. So these are the pharaoh's ducks being herded. So these are sort of close up. These are pretty good drawings of cattle. I spent a lot of time about 10 years ago trying to learn to draw cattle. And I think this is a good drawing. That the person has looked at cattle closely. Okay, so there's also a party going on in Nabaman's tomb on the wall. And it's a pretty rowdy party in some ways. Okay, so there's two registers, and then the guests are shown here, And the guests are all shown in profile sitting on chairs. So here's an Egyptian chair, and you see men and women sitting on these chairs, possibly wearing wigs. And then down here, there's some strippers. I mean, it sounds incredible, but that's what they are. Art historians would probably describe them as dancing girls, but they're strippers. All right, here they are, dancing basically naked with some jewelry on, and also serving the wine. So here's one of the practically naked servers. You can't see her whole body, but her head, but these are the jugs of wine that they're carrying to the guests. And these are the musicians, who also women. All right, so that's really interesting. The musicians are, two of them are shown in profile, as is the convention of Egyptian painting, but two of them are shown frontally. One of them's playing a sort of double penny whistle here. Hang on a second. Okay, so normally, like that, but she's got two, one that she's playing with her left hand and one that she's playing with her right hand. I don't know how you would do that exactly, but that's what she's doing. And the other women are clapping. And the other thing I think is great is the soles of their feet here. You can see their feet. And they're kind of shaking their braids. You know, they've got these long braids, extensions maybe, and they're going. So even their cloth of their clothes seems to be kind of vibrating. So these are the musicians clapping, and she's playing a tune on her double penny whistle. And then these girls are dancing, and this girl is serving wine, and she's got some kind of weird, oh, that's the back of the chair, okay. So here's a detail showing the dancers and the wine servers. So in Nabaman's ideal afterlife, he would be duck hunting during the day, and at night he would go to a party with a lot of wine and a lot of music and strippers. So if heaven ain't a lot like Dixie, I don't want to go. All right, so that's it. Stop share. Okay, any questions? I'm going to stop recording now.